Hey guys, what's going on? Today, I want to talk to you about Alexander the Great. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that Alexander is one of the most famous people in the history of mankind. And whether you think he was a superachieving genius or a megalomaniacal, bloodthirsty tyrant, there's no question that Alexander was larger than life. And he continued to be larger than life in death. Case in point, his funeral arrangements. According to the ancient historian Diodorus, his body was placed in a coffin made of hammered gold and crammed with perfumes. The coffin was then placed in another coffin made of hammered gold. His funeral carriage took the form of a miniature temple, which, get this, took 2 years to construct. I'd really like to show you pictures of the coffins and the carriage, but I can't, because at some point they disappeared. What happened to them? Do we have any hope of finding them? In today's video, I'll try to answer these questions. Before going any further, just a quick disclaimer, we have almost no information on what became of the carriage, so I'm going to be focusing my attention on the coffins. So, let's begin. We know that Alexander died in 323 BC, Babylon. After about 2 years, his body began to be transported back to his homeland of Macedonia. Only the trip didn't go as planned. The thing is, a lot of Alexander's generals, all of them actually, considered his body to be a very precious commodity. They wanted it for themselves. And so, while the funeral carriage was passing through Syria, one of the generals swooped in and said, "Change of plans. The king's body belongs to me now." His name was Ptolemy, and he'd been given control of Egypt after Alexander's death. What did he do? He sent the carriage to the city of Alexandria in Egypt, and he had the coffins exhibited in a mausoleum. He proceeded to found a dynasty called the Ptolemies. As long as the Ptolemies ruled Egypt, the coffins were in safe hands. Now, many years later, in 31 BC, Egypt was conquered by the Romans. Luckily, the Romans had massive respect for Alexander. In military terms, he was what every Roman wanted to be. And so, for a while, the mausoleum and its contents continued to enjoy protection. Until they didn't. The decades immediately following the Roman conquest of Egypt had seen the birth of Christianity. In the 3rd and 4th centuries AD, Christianity began to spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire. In 313 AD, it was legalized by Emperor Constantine the Great. In 380 AD, it became the only authorized religion. Shortly thereafter, between 389 and 391 AD, Emperor Theodosius the Great passed a series of decrees, a series of laws, encouraging the destruction of pagan sites. And wouldn't you know it, this encouraged Christians across the empire to destroy pagan sites, including in Alexandria. So it was that in 391 AD, a massive riot engulfed the city. The event was a tragedy for the legacy of Alexander. After the riot, we have no further historical references to the location of Alexander's resting place. In fact, Archbishop John Chrysostom, who visited Alexandria in 400 AD, mocked the local pagans for not knowing the whereabouts of Alexander's tomb. You can probably guess what had happened. So now, the coffins were lost. But they weren't entirely forgotten. Over the next 12 centuries, as Alexandria transitioned from a Christian city to a Muslim one. Several people claim to have seen the tomb of Alexander in a chapel in the courtyard of a certain mosque. We have one reported sighting dating to the 9th century, one dating to the 10th century, and one dating to the 16th century. Do these sightings have any credibility? I think they do. In 1798, during an invasion of Egypt by Napoleon Bonaparte, French Egyptologists found a sarcophagus in the very same chapel where the sightings had occurred. By the way, that's an actual photo of the sarcophagus. It's on display at the British Museum in London. The bad news is that the sarcophagus was empty when the French found it. But it could have been emptied at some point after the last reported sighting. But wait, just a minute. Diodorus doesn't mention a sarcophagus in his description of Alexander's funeral arrangements. So, what are we supposed to think? One possibility is that Ptolemy transferred Alexander's body to the sarcophagus and, presumably, melted down the coffins. We know that a pharaoh ruled Egypt between 360 and 342 BC. And as pharaohs usually did, this one commissioned a sarcophagus for himself. But he never got to use it because he was thrown out of Egypt before his death. And a few years later, in 332 BC, along came Alexander and the Macedonians. So this might explain how Alexander's body could have ended up in the sarcophagus that's currently on display at the British Museum. I know it's not the most satisfying of explanations for what happened to the coffins and the body, and it bears mentioning that there are other possible explanations. Some people claim that during the riots in Alexandria in 391 AD, local pagans made a desperate effort to save Alexander's body. What did they do? They rebranded it as St. Mark's. St. Mark had been an early Christian. He'd been martyred in Alexandria in the 3rd century AD. So the ruse was apparently enough to fool the Christian mob. Centuries went by. Eventually, Alexandria came under the rule of the Arabs. And local Christians became afraid that St. Mark's tomb would come to harm. In 828, they decided to smuggle the body to Venice for safekeeping. The plan was a success, and the body made it safely to Venice. Initially, it was laid to rest in a small church. Then it was moved to a crypt in the much bigger, and aptly named, Basilica of St. Mark. And in 1811, in response to flooding, the Catholic Church reburied the body on the main floor of the basilica. But you may say that this story is pure speculation. Well, actually, it's a little more than that. First off, according to a 13th century Venetian chronicler, the corpse gave off a strong aroma of spices. This fits nicely with Diodorus' description of the inner coffin being crammed with perfumes. Second, in the 1990s, a large piece of carved limestone was found a few meters from the site of the original tomb in the crypt. It featured a star motif at its center. This motif is an almost perfect match to the Virginia star, which was closely associated to Alexander's family. So, how do we verify whether a story is true? The answer is we can't, at least not for the foreseeable future. We would need to open the tomb and conduct an analysis of the remains contained within. Unfortunately, the Catholic Church won't allow this. And it's not difficult to see why. St. Mark's Basilica attracts over 5 million visitors a year. If the tomb turned out to be a pagan monument, if the building's origins turned out to be a sham, it's likely that the basilica would lose most of its visitors. The last explanation for what happened to the coffins takes us back to Alexandria. This archaeologist, Calliope Limnios Papakosto, believes that Alexander's resting place could lie in Alexandria's ancient royal quarter. She's been conducting an excavation in the royal quarter since 2005. I don't know on what grounds Papakosta decided to excavate in the royal quarter, but I do know that she recently uncovered a marble statue of Alexander, datable to the 4th or 3rd century BC, and that she has no intention of giving up. Therefore, she probably represents our best hope of solving the mystery of Alexander's tomb. Thanks for watching the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.